The blood on her hands had long since washed away, but Eleanor Harper could still feel the phantom weight of it as she stepped off the stage in Ellsworth, Kansas, her worn leather valise clutched tightly against her chest. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street, and she paused to steady herself, breathing in the dry air that was so different from the humid thickness of the battlefield hospitals she had left behind. It was June of 1868, 3 years since the war had ended, yet the memories still clung to her like smoke. Eleanor was 24 years old, though she often felt decades older. The war had stolen her youth in ways that went beyond the calendar. She had been barely 19 when she volunteered as a nurse, lying about her experience because the need was so desperate that no one questioned a young woman willing to wade into hell itself. She had seen boys younger than herself take their last breaths in her arms, had held pressure on wounds that would not stop bleeding, had whispered prayers over men who cried for their mothers in the dark. Now she was here, in this rough Kansas cattle town, hoping to start fresh. Her cousin Margaret had written that Ellsworth needed a woman with medical knowledge, that the town doctor was overwhelmed and aging, that there was work for someone willing to help. Eleanor had saved every penny from her nursing wages, meager as they were, and bought passage west. She had nothing left for her in Pennsylvania but graves and ghosts. The Giedow was crowded with cowboys and cattle. Ellsworth sat at the junction of the Kansas Pacific Railway and the cattle trails coming up from Texas, which made it wild and prosperous in equal measure. Saloons lined the street alongside general stores and a bank that looked newer than most of the buildings. Dust kicked up from hundreds of hooves, and the air smelled of livestock and sweat and opportunity. Eleanor asked directions to her cousin's boarding house from a woman sweeping the porch of a dress shop, and made her way down the wooden sidewalk, her modest blue traveling dress already coated in a fine layer of prairie dust. Margaret's place was a 2-story structure at the edge of the main thoroughfare, painted white with green shutters that had seen better days but still maintained a sense of respectability. Margaret herself was a whirlwind of welcome, pulling Eleanor into a tight embrace before she could even knock. She was 10 years Eleanor's senior, widowed young, and had made her way west to run this boarding house with the kind of determined practicality that Eleanor admired. "You look exhausted," Margaret said, holding Eleanor at arm's length to study her face. Come in. Your room is ready upstairs, and I have stew on the stove. We will get you settled, and tomorrow I will take you to meet Dr. Abernathy." Eleanor allowed herself to be guided inside, grateful for the relative coolness of the house's interior and the genuine warmth in her cousin's eyes. For the first time in months, she felt something close to hope. That evening, as Eleanor unpacked her few belongings in the small but clean room Margaret had prepared, she heard the commotion from the street below. Raised voices, the thunder of hooves, gunshots that made her flinch despite herself. Margaret appeared in the doorway, looking unconcerned. "Just cowboys blowing off steam," she explained. "You will get used to it. Most of them are harmless, just young men far from home with money in their pockets and nothing to do with it but drink and make noise. The marshal keeps things from getting too out of hand." Eleanor nodded, but the gunshots had awakened something in her, a tension she thought she had left behind. She sat on the edge of the bed and forced herself to breathe slowly, counting to 10 the way she had learned to do when the artillery fire got too close to the hospital tents. She did not know it then, but one of the men riding through town that evening was Vincent Hale, a trail boss who had just delivered 2,000 head of cattle to the stockyards. He was 27 years old, tall and weathered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey. He had fought in the war too, on the Union side, though he rarely spoke of it. Afterward, he had drifted south into Texas and learned the cattle business from the ground up, earning a reputation as a man who could be trusted to get a herd through to market no matter what obstacles stood in the way. Vincent was tired down to his bones. The drive from Texas had taken 3 months, through swollen rivers and past hostile territory, through storms that spooked the cattle into stampedes and heat that baked the ground hard as iron. He had lost 2 men along the way, one to a snakebite and another in a river crossing, and the weight of their death sat heavy on his shoulders even as he paid out the remaining cowboys their wages. He did not drink much, never had developed a taste for losing control, but he accepted a whiskey at the saloon because it was expected, because the men he had ridden with needed to celebrate their survival. He stood at the bar and let the noise wash over him, thinking about the letter he needed to write to the families of the men who had not made it, wondering how you told a mother that her son had drowned doing a job that paid $30 a month. The next morning, Eleanor met Dr. Abernathy in his office, which was attached to his home on a quiet side street. He was a kindly man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that trembled slightly with palsy. He questioned her extensively about her experience, and Eleanor answered honestly, describing the field hospitals, the types of wounds she had treated, the surgeries she had assisted with, the diseases that had sometimes killed more men than bullets. Dr. Abernathy listened with increasing relief evident on his lined face. "Miss Harper, I will be frank with you. This town needs help that I can no longer adequately provide alone. My hands are not steady enough for delicate work anymore, and there are days when the sheer number of patients overwhelms me. Cowboys with injuries from falls and fights, women in difficult childbirths, children with fevers, workers from the railroad with broken bones. If you are willing, I would like to take you on, not just as an assistant, but as a genuine colleague. The pay is modest, but I can offer you room and board here in addition to wages." Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "I accept, doctor. Thank you. When may I start?" "Today, if you are rested enough. I have a woman 3 days into labor who is not progressing well, and I would value another opinion." Eleanor did not hesitate. She sent word to Margaret, collected her medical bag from the boarding house, and followed Dr. Abernathy to a small house where a woman named Sarah lay exhausted and frightened, her husband pacing outside. Eleanor washed her hands thoroughly, examined Sarah gently, and quickly determined that the baby was positioned wrong. Working together, she and Dr. Abernathy managed to turn the infant, and 2 hours later, a healthy boy entered the world, squalling lustily. The gratitude in Sarah's eyes as she held her son was the first thing that had made Eleanor feel truly useful since the war ended. This was why she had learned nursing, not for the horror of the battlefield, but for moments like this, when skill and knowledge could mean the difference between life and death in the best possible way. Word spread quickly through Ellsworth that Dr. Abernathy had a new nurse who really knew her business. Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself busier than she had been since the war. She set broken bones and stitched wounds, dosed children with fever medicine, and helped women through illnesses both physical and female in nature. She assisted in 2 more childbirths and 3 surgeries. Dr. Abernathy treated her as a true partner, often deferring to her judgment, especially in cases involving trauma wounds where her battlefield experience gave her knowledge he lacked. She fell into bed exhausted every night and rose each morning with a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for too long. She was still haunted by the war, still startled by sudden loud noises, still sometimes woke from dreams, where she was back in the hospital tent, with the screams of the wounded echoing around her. But the work helped, gave her something to focus on besides the past. It was late July, nearly 6 weeks after her arrival, when Vincent Hale came into Dr. Abernathy's office. Eleanor was alone, sorting through the medicine cabinet and taking inventory. She heard the door open and turned to see a tall man standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in the way men often did when confronted with medical care. "Doctor is out on a call," Eleanor said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am Miss Harper, his nurse. May I help you?" Vincent hesitated, and Eleanor took the opportunity to really look at him. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun. There was something about the way he carried himself, a kind of careful control that she recognized from somewhere she could not quite place. "It is probably nothing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I have had a pain in my side for a few days, but it is getting worse instead of better. Thought I should have someone look at it before I head back to Texas." Eleanor nodded professionally. "Please, come in and sit down. Let me examine you." Vincent moved slowly to the examination table, and Eleanor noticed the careful way he held himself, protecting his right side. When he removed his hat, she saw his hair was damp with sweat, despite the relative coolness of the office. "How long has the pain been present?" she asked, washing her hands in the basin. "About 4 days. Thought I pulled something loading cattle, but it keeps getting sharper." "May I?" Eleanor indicated his shirt, and Vincent unbuttoned it slowly, clearly embarrassed. When he pulled it aside, Eleanor saw the angry red inflammation spreading from a point just above his hip. She pressed gently around the area, and he hissed in pain. "Sir, you have an infection," she said firmly. See this red streaking? That is a very serious sign. When did you injure yourself? Vincent frowned, thinking back. About a week ago, I reckon. Caught myself on a nail pulling down a piece of fence. Did not seem like much at the time, just a scratch. Eleanor leaned closer and found the wound, a small puncture that had closed over, but was now hot to the touch and weeping pus. The wound closed with infection trapped inside. If we do not treat this aggressively, it could poison your blood. That red line is the infection spreading. Have you been feeling fevered? Some, Vincent admitted. Thought it was just the heat. Eleanor did not waste time. I need to open this wound and drain the infection, then clean it thoroughly. It will be painful, but it is necessary. The alternative is much worse, I promise you that. Something in her tone, the absolute certainty and the hint of experience with much worse things, made Vincent nod. Do what you need to do, miss. Eleanor gathered her supplies, including a bottle of whiskey for disinfecting both the wound and, if needed, the patient. She heated a scalpel in the flame of the lamp and explained what she was going to do. Vincent listened with his jaw set, and when she made the first cut, he barely flinched, though his knuckles went white where he gripped the edge of the table. She worked quickly and efficiently, draining the infection, cleaning the wound with whiskey that had to burn like hellfire, and packing it with clean gauze soaked in carbolic solution. The whole time, Vincent did not make a sound beyond sharp intakes of breath, and Eleanor found herself impressed by his stoicism. You have done this before, she said, as she bandaged the wound firmly. It was not a question. Vincent met her eyes, and there was recognition in his gaze now, as if he too had noticed something familiar about her. The war, he said simply. Field hospital in Virginia, after Spotsylvania. Took shrapnel in my leg and shoulder. The nurses there put me back together. Eleanor's hands stilled for just a moment before she continued wrapping the bandage. That was a hard battle, she said quietly. A lot of wounded. I was at a hospital near Fredericksburg. We got some of the overflow from that engagement. Something passed between them then, an understanding that went beyond words. They had both been in that hell, had both seen the things that normal people in normal times could not imagine. Vincent's eyes searched her face, and Eleanor saw the question forming. You were one of them, he said. One of the nurses who worked the field hospitals. Yes, Eleanor said, tying off the bandage and stepping back. For 3 years. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. Then I owe thanks to you and women like you. The nurse who tended me, I never even learned her name, but she saved my life. Infection had set in by the time I got to the hospital, much like this but worse. She stayed up all night keeping watch, changing bandages, fighting the fever. I would have died without her. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had sat vigil over so many wounded men, had fought so many battles against fever and infection with nothing but cool water and clean bandages and sheer determination. We did what we could, she said. It never felt like enough. It was more than you know, Vincent said, and the intensity in his eyes made Eleanor look away, suddenly overwhelmed. She cleared her throat and became professional again. You need to keep this wound clean and dry. Change the dressing twice daily, and if you see the red streaking get worse or if fever develops, come back immediately. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity for at least a week, longer if possible. Vincent nodded, standing carefully and buttoning his shirt. I was planning to head back to Texas in a few days, but I will delay if you think I should. I think you should, Eleanor said firmly. Travel in your condition could make things much worse. Give your body time to fight this infection. Yes, madam, Vincent said, and there was the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Never could argue with a nurse. Over the following week, Vincent came in daily for Eleanor to check his wound and change his dressings. The infection gradually subsided under her careful treatment, the angry red fading to pink and then to healthy skin. They talked during these visits, carefully at first, then with increasing ease. Eleanor learned that Vincent had been a ranch hand before the war, had fought with the cavalry, and had gone to Texas afterward because he could not bear to return to his family's farm in Missouri, where his brother had died, and his father could not look at him without grief. He had learned the trail business, saved his money, and now contracted independently to guide herds north for ranchers who trusted his skill. Vincent learned that Eleanor had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, that her father was a minister who had supported her desire to volunteer as a nurse despite the scandal it caused, that her mother had died when she was young, and her father had followed 2 years after the war ended, his heart simply giving out from exhaustion and sorrow. She spoke of the soldiers she had tended, the ones who lived and the far too many who had not, and Vincent listened with the understanding of someone who had been there, who did not need explanations for the haunted look that sometimes crossed her face. "Did you ever think about stopping?" Vincent asked one afternoon, as Eleanor carefully removed the old bandage. The wound was healing beautifully now, clean and closing properly. "During the war, I mean. Did you ever want to just walk away?" Eleanor considered the question as she cleaned the wound gently. "Every day," she admitted. "But then another wagon would come in with wounded men, and they would look at you with such hope, such trust, that you could help them. How could I walk away from that?" "You saved more than you know," Vincent said quietly, and Eleanor looked up to find him watching her, with an expression that made her heart skip. "Every man you helped, everyone who survived because of your care, he went on to have a life. He had children maybe, or built something, or just lived to see another sunrise. That ripples out, Miss Harper. That matters more than you can measure." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back quickly. "Thank you," she managed. "I needed to hear that, I think." They were sitting very close together, Eleanor's hands still gentle on his mostly healed side, and the air between them seemed to thicken with something neither of them had expected. Vincent reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time, "may I call on you? Properly, I mean. Not as your patient." Eleanor's breath caught. She had not thought about romance, had not considered that there might be space in her war-scarred heart for such things. But looking at Vincent, at this man who understood the darkness she carried and did not flinch from it, she found herself wanting to try. "I would like that," she said softly. "Vincent?" His smile transformed his face, made him look younger and lighter, and Eleanor felt an answering warmth bloom in her chest. She finished bandaging his wound with hands that trembled slightly, and when he left the office that day, he tipped his hat to her with a promise to return the next morning, not as a patient, but as a gentleman caller. Dr. Abernathy, who returned shortly after Vincent's departure, took one look at Eleanor's flushed face and knowing smile. "The trail boss, is it? He is a good man from what I hear. Honest, hard-working, does not drink to excess or frequent the gambling halls. You could do worse." Eleanor laughed, feeling almost giddy. "I have only agreed to let him call on me, doctor. It is hardly a proposal." "Yet," Dr. Abernathy said, with a twinkle in his eye, "mark my words, my dear. That young man has the look of someone who has found something precious. He will not let you slip away easily." That evening, Eleanor dressed with more care than usual for supper at Margaret's boarding house. Her cousin noticed immediately and extracted the story with practiced efficiency, then declared herself delighted. "A trail boss," Margaret said, braiding Eleanor's hair into a more flattering style. "Steady work, good money if he is successful. And you say he is educated, can read and write?" "Yes," Eleanor said, thinking of how Vincent had quoted Shakespeare during one of their conversations, a line from Henry V about once more into the breach. He had smiled self-consciously afterward, admitting that a sergeant in his unit had loved that play and recited it so often that everyone in the company had it memorized. "And he treated you with respect, was proper in his behavior?" "Completely," Eleanor assured her. "Margaret, he understands about the war. He was there too, as a soldier. He does not think I am strange for having nightmares or being startled by sudden noises. He just understands." Margaret's expression softened. "That is worth more than gold, dear heart. To be understood, truly understood, by someone who cares for you." Vincent arrived the next morning with a small bouquet of wildflowers that he had clearly picked himself from the prairie outside town. Eleanor found them more charming than any hothouse roses could have been. They walked together through Ellsworth, and Eleanor showed him the parts of town she had come to know in her weeks there. They talked easily, sometimes falling into comfortable silences that felt natural rather than awkward. He told her about Texas, about the ranch country where cattle grazed on land that stretched to the horizon, about the challenge and satisfaction of bringing a herd through to market. She told him about her hopes to, perhaps one day, expand medical services in Ellsworth, to create a proper hospital that could serve not just the town, but the surrounding ranches and settlements. "That is a fine dream," Vincent said. "This country needs people like you, Eleanor. People who want to build things instead of just take." "Is that what you want?" she asked. "To build something?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, looking out at the prairie. "I have been drifting since the war ended," he admitted. "Could not settle, could not figure out where I belonged. But lately I have been thinking maybe it is time to stop moving, time to put down roots somewhere." He looked at her as he said it, and Eleanor felt the implication of his words settle over her like a warm blanket. "Kansas could use good ranchers," she said carefully. "There is land available for those willing to work it." "I have some money saved," Vincent said. "Enough to buy land, start a small herd. It would not be easy at first, but I know the business now. Know what works and what does not." They had reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The sun was high and hot, and grasshoppers sang in the dry grass. Vincent took Eleanor's hand carefully, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "I am not a man who moves fast usually," he said. "But the war taught me that time is precious, that you cannot count on having tomorrow to say the things that matter. So, I am going to be honest with you, Eleanor. From the moment you started tending my wound, I felt something. And every day since then, that feeling has grown stronger. I know we have not known each other long, but I would like to know you longer, much longer if you will allow it." Eleanor's heart was pounding, but it was not fear she felt. It was possibility, hope, the sense that maybe her life was not over at 24, that maybe there could be joy and love and all the things she had thought were casualties of the war. "I feel it too," she said, squeezing his hand. "And it frightens me, Vincent. I have seen so much loss, so much death. The thought of caring for someone again, of risking that pain." "I know," Vincent said, and his eyes were full of understanding. "I have lost people too, my brother, friends from the war, the men who died on the trail under my watch. But Eleanor, we cannot let fear keep us from living. The ones we lost, they do not get to make new memories or feel sunshine on their faces or fall in love. We do. And I think maybe we owe it to them to grab hold of whatever happiness we can find." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. "That is a beautiful way to think about it," she said. Vincent reached up with his free hand and gently wiped the tears away. "May I court you properly, Eleanor Harper? May I take you to dances and buy you supper and sit on your cousin's porch and try to convince you that I would make a decent husband someday?" Eleanor laughed through her tears. "Yes, Vincent Hale, you may court me, and I think you would make more than a decent husband when the time comes." He kissed her then, softly and carefully, and Eleanor felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. This was not the ending of her story. It was a beginning. Over the following months, Vincent stayed in Ellsworth, finding work helping at the stockyards and saving every penny. He visited Eleanor daily, and when Dr. Abernathy suffered a bad spell with his rheumatism that left him bedridden for a week, Vincent was there to help Eleanor manage the practice. He carried supplies, moved heavy equipment, and even assisted with some of the more difficult patients who needed a man's strength. Eleanor saw him with patience and understood more about his character. He was gentle with children, patient with the elderly, respectful with everyone, regardless of their station. One afternoon, a drifter came in with a badly infected hand, and when it became clear the man had no money, Vincent quietly paid the bill himself. "He was someone's son once," Vincent said when Eleanor questioned him about it. "Maybe someone's brother or friend. He deserves care same as anyone." They attended church socials together, where Eleanor noticed that Vincent was well-liked and respected by the community. They went to the harvest dance in September, and Vincent proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, admitting that his mother had insisted her boys learn the basics before they were grown. "She said a man who could not dance was a man who would never learn to be comfortable in polite society," he said, spinning Eleanor competently through a reel. "I thought it was nonsense at the time, but I am grateful for it now." It was in October, as the prairie grass turned gold and the air took on the crisp edge of autumn, that Eleanor had her first real test of whether she could truly leave the war behind. A fight broke out between rival cowboy crews near one of the saloons, and gunfire erupted. 3 men were wounded, 1 seriously, and they were all brought to Dr. Abernathy's office in a rush of blood and shouting. The old doctor was out on a call delivering a baby, and Eleanor was alone. When the door burst open and she saw the wounded men, smelled the blood and gunpowder, heard the shouting, something in her mind fractured. Suddenly she was not in Ellsworth, but back in the hospital tent, back in the chaos and horror, and she froze. Vincent appeared moments later, alerted by the gunfire. He took in the situation instantly, saw Eleanor standing rigid with terror in her eyes. He moved to her quickly, putting himself between her and the wounded men, and spoke quietly but firmly. "Eleanor, look at me. Look at my eyes. You are in Ellsworth, Kansas. It is October 1868. The war is over. These men need you, and you can help them because you are the best nurse in this territory. Breathe with me. In, out, in, out." His voice was steady and calm, his eyes locked on hers, and slowly Eleanor felt herself come back to the present. She took a shaky breath, then another, and then her training took over. She moved past Vincent and began triaging the wounded with quick efficiency. "You," she said to one of the cowboys who had brought the wounded men in, "boil water, lots of it. You, get clean sheets from the cabinet there. And you, run and fetch Dr. Abernathy from the Johnson's place. Tell him we have gunshot wounds and I need his help." Vincent stayed, assisting her just as he had during his weeks helping around the office. He held pressure on wounds while she sutured, kept patients calm with his steady presence, and handed her instruments before she had to ask. They worked together like a practice team, and by the time Dr. Abernathy arrived, Eleanor had stabilized all 3 patients. The one with the serious wound, a young man barely 20 who had taken a bullet near his spine, required delicate surgery. Dr. Abernathy's hands were not steady enough, and he knew it. "Eleanor, I need you to take the lead on this one. I will guide you, but you must do the work." Eleanor had assisted with surgeries before, but never taken the primary role. She looked at the young man, unconscious from the laudanum they had given him, and thought about all the soldiers who had died, because there had not been enough trained hands to help them. She thought about what Vincent had said, about owing it to the ones they had lost, to grab hold of life with both hands. "Talk me through it," she said to Dr. Abernathy, and began to scrub her hands thoroughly. The surgery took 3 hours. Vincent stayed the entire time, ready to help if needed, his presence a steadying force at Eleanor's back. When it was over, and the young man's breathing was steady, his wound cleaned and closed, Eleanor's hands were shaking with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. Vincent took her outside into the cool evening air and held her while she cried, releasing the terror and tension of the day. "You did it," he said into her hair. "You saved him, Eleanor. You were magnificent." "I froze at first," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I was back there, Vincent, back in the war. But you came back," he said firmly, pulling away enough to look at her face. "When it mattered, you came back and you did your job brilliantly. That is what courage is, Eleanor. Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs to be done despite it." She looked up at him, at this man who had seen her at her worst and had not flinched, who had brought her back from the edge of panic with steady words and steadier presence. "I love you," she said, the words emerging without planning, pure truth spoken aloud. "Vincent, I love you." His face transformed with joy. "Eleanor Harper, I have loved you since you scolded me for neglecting an infection and then proceeded to save my life. I love your strength and your compassion and your determination. I love how you care for people, how you fight for them. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the feeling she had been holding inside. They stood together in the gathering darkness, and Eleanor felt the last pieces of her war-shattered heart click back into place. Not the same as before, but stronger for having been broken and mended. 2 weeks later, Vincent came to her with news. He had found land for sale, a quarter section about 5 miles outside Ellsworth, with a creek running through it and good grass for cattle. It was not a large spread, but it was a start, and the price was reasonable enough that his savings would cover it with some left over for stock. "I want to buy it," he said. "I want to build a house there, start a ranch. But Eleanor, I do not want to do it alone. I want to do it with you. Will you marry me?" Eleanor did not hesitate. "Yes, yes, Vincent, I will marry you." They were married in December, on a cold, clear Sunday with half the town in attendance. Eleanor wore a dress that Margaret had helped her sew, simple cream-colored wool that was practical and pretty. Vincent wore his best suit, brushed and pressed, and when he saw Eleanor walking toward him, down the aisle of the little church, his eyes grew bright with emotion. The minister, who was not Eleanor's father, but reminded her of him in his kind demeanor, spoke about love and partnership, about building a life together through good times and hard. When Vincent slipped a simple gold band onto Eleanor's finger, his hand trembled slightly, and when she placed a matching ring on his, she felt the rightness of it deep in her bones. They held a small reception at Margaret's boarding house, with cake and coffee and dancing to fiddle music. Dr. Abernathy gave a toast that made Eleanor cry, speaking of how she had come to Ellsworth broken and lost, but had found healing in service and love in unexpected places. That night, in the room Margaret had prepared for them, Vincent was gentle and patient with Eleanor, taking time to learn what pleased her, to show her that physical love could be tender and joyful. They explored each other carefully, building trust and intimacy together, and when they finally came together fully, Eleanor felt a completeness she had never experienced before. In the morning, they rose early to begin the work of building their life. The land Vincent had purchased came with a small cabin, barely more than one room, but it was solid and weatherproof. They spent the winter making it a home, Vincent hunting for meat, while Eleanor preserved and stored food, both of them working to weatherproof the structure better and make plans for the larger house they would build come spring. Eleanor continued working with Dr. Abernathy, riding into town 3 days a week on the gentle mare Vincent had bought for her. He had insisted she know how to ride properly and had taught her himself with patient instruction until she felt confident in the saddle. On the days she was home, she tended their small household and studied medical texts that Dr. Abernathy loaned her, always learning, always improving her skills. Vincent built a small barn and bought 6 head of cattle to start, planning to grow the herd slowly and carefully. He was gone sometimes for days at a time, still taking occasional trail boss work to bring in cash money, and Eleanor hated the separations but understood the necessity. They were building something, creating a future out of hard work and determination. It was during one of Vincent's absences in late February that Eleanor had an experience that would change the course of their lives in unexpected ways. A family traveling west had stopped in Ellsworth, and their daughter, barely 16, had fallen desperately ill with pneumonia. The family had no money for proper care and were planning to move on, hoping the girl would recover on the trail. Eleanor heard about the situation from Margaret and immediately went to where the family had camped on the outskirts of town. The girl, whose name was Lily, was burning with fever, her breathing labored and rattling. Her parents looked exhausted and frightened, and the 3 younger children huddled together, watching with wide, scared eyes. "Let me help," Eleanor said firmly. "I am a nurse, and your daughter needs treatment now. Please." The father, a weathered farmer named Sam, shook his head. "We cannot pay, miss. We have barely enough to get us to Oregon as it is." "I did not ask for payment," Eleanor said. "I asked to help. Now, let me examine her before it is too late." She would not take no for an answer, and eventually Sam relented. Eleanor had Lily moved to a room at Margaret's boarding house, much to her cousin's credit, never questioned the charity, and spent the next 4 days fighting for the girl's life. She administered medications, kept the fever down with cool cloths, helped the girl breathe with steam treatments, and never left her side for more than a few hours at a time. Vincent returned home to find his wife not there, and immediately rode into town to discover what had happened. He found Eleanor exhausted and hollow-eyed, sitting beside a sleeping girl while her parents dozed in chairs nearby. "She is going to make it," Eleanor said when she saw him. "The fever broke this morning. She is going to live, Vincent." He looked at his wife, at the fierce joy in her tired face, and felt his heart swell with love. "Of course she is. You would not let her do anything else. Come on, love. Let her parents watch her now. You need rest." Eleanor let him guide her home, and slept for 14 hours straight. When she woke, Vincent had hot food ready and listened as she told him about Lily and her family, about how grateful the parents were, how the mother had cried and held Eleanor's hands and called her an angel. "You saved that girl's life," Vincent said. "Her parents will never forget that. She will never forget it." "It is what I am meant to do," Eleanor said simply. "Vincent, I know we are working to build the ranch, to make a living here, but I need to keep practicing medicine. It is not just something I do, it is part of who I am." Vincent reached across the table and took her hand. "I know that, Eleanor. I would never ask you to stop. We will figure out how to make it work, the ranch and your nursing both. Maybe someday we will be successful enough that I can handle the ranch mostly on my own, and you can practice full-time. Or maybe we will find some other arrangement. The point is, we will make it work together." This was the pattern of their life over the following years. They worked hard, saved carefully, and slowly built something solid. Vincent's reputation as a skilled rancher grew, and he was able to stop taking trail boss work and focus entirely on their own spread. They enlarged their herd, built the bigger house they had dreamed of, and Vincent hired a young man named Samuel to help with the ranch work so Eleanor could focus more on her nursing. Eleanor's medical practice also grew. Word of her skill spread beyond Ellsworth to the surrounding settlements and ranches. She delivered babies in sod houses on the prairie, treated injuries from farming accidents, and nursed families through the illnesses that swept through periodically. Dr. Abernathy grew to rely on her completely, and eventually made her a full partner in the practice, insisting she deserved the recognition and the increased share of income it brought. She never charged people who could not pay, which sometimes frustrated Vincent from a purely practical standpoint, but he never seriously tried to change her mind. "You have the softest heart in Kansas," he would say, shaking his head with a smile. "Lucky for the people of Kansas, I suppose." In 1871, 3 years into their marriage, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She had begun to wonder if children were possible for her, had worried that perhaps the years of stress and poor conditions during the war had damaged her body in ways she could not see. When she missed her monthly courses and then felt the familiar symptoms, she could barely believe it. She told Vincent one evening after supper, simply and directly, "I am carrying a child, our child." Vincent went very still, and then his face broke into the widest smile Eleanor had ever seen. He pulled her into his arms carefully, as if she might break, and pressed his face into her hair. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy?" Vincent pulled back to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. "Eleanor, I never thought I would have this. A wife I love, a home, a child on the way. After the war, after everything, I thought maybe those things were not meant for men like me. And then you came into my life and gave me hope for a future I could not even imagine before. Yes, my love, I am happy. I am the happiest man in Kansas." The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor suffered from terrible sickness in the first months, could barely keep food down, and lost weight despite Vincent's concerned attempts to tempt her with every dish he could think of. But she was a nurse, knew that this was common and would pass, and endured with the same stoic determination she brought to everything. By her second trimester, she felt better and threw herself back into work with renewed energy. Dr. Abernathy tried to convince her to slow down, to rest more, but Eleanor was not one to sit idle when there was work to be done. She did agree to let Vincent or Samuel drive her on calls instead of riding herself, and she stopped assisting with surgeries once her belly grew too large to maneuver easily. In October of 1871, Eleanor went into labor 3 weeks before her due date. It was evening, and Vincent was out checking on the cattle. Eleanor felt the first pains and recognized them immediately for what they were. She sent Samuel running for Margaret, while she prepared herself mentally for what was coming. She had delivered dozens of babies, but delivering her own was an entirely different prospect. By the time Vincent came thundering back to the house, alerted by Samuel, Eleanor was well into labor, and Margaret was with her, along with Dr. Abernathy, who had arrived just before Vincent. Eleanor was handling the pain as she handled everything, with gritted teeth and fierce concentration. Vincent wanted to stay with her, and Eleanor, despite conventional wisdom that men should wait elsewhere, wanted him there. He held her hand and wiped her forehead, and told her she was doing wonderfully even as he looked terrified by what she was going through. "I have delivered babies in worse conditions than this," Eleanor panted between contractions. "One time, in a barn during artillery fire, with no supplies but what I had in my pockets. I can do this, Vincent. We can do this." He believed her because she gave him no choice, her strength flowing into him through their joined hands. When their son finally entered the world, red-faced and squalling with outrage, Vincent wept openly with joy and relief. They named him William, after Vincent's brother who had died in the war. Eleanor held her son and felt a love so fierce and primal that it almost frightened her. This tiny person, this perfect combination of her and Vincent, was depending on her utterly. She would protect him with her life, raise him to be good and strong and kind. Vincent held his son with trembling hands, amazed at how small and fragile William was, at the tiny fingers that wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "He is perfect," he whispered, Eleanor, he is absolutely perfect." Motherhood was harder than Eleanor expected. William was colicky and slept poorly, crying for hours despite every soothing technique Eleanor knew. She was exhausted, running on little sleep while still trying to handle medical emergencies when they arose. Vincent helped as much as he could, walking the floor with William so Eleanor could rest. But he could not nurse the baby, and that was what William often wanted. There were moments when Eleanor felt overwhelmed, when the crying seemed endless and she could not figure out what her son needed. During these times, Vincent would take William and send Eleanor outside to breathe, to have 10 minutes of quiet, and somehow that was enough to let her gather herself and try again. "You are doing wonderfully," Vincent would tell her during the darkest moments. "Look at him, Eleanor. He is healthy and growing. You are exactly the mother he needs." Slowly, as William grew, things got easier. He began sleeping longer stretches, his stomach settled, and his personality started to emerge. He was curious and alert, always watching the world around him with wide eyes that were turning the same whiskey color as Vincent's. Eleanor gradually returned to work, bringing William with her when possible, leaving him with Margaret when necessary. Dr. Abernathy was endlessly patient with having a baby in the office, and many patients found William's presence soothing rather than disruptive. Life fell into a new rhythm, busier but richer than before. The ranch continued to prosper, and Vincent hired another hand, which freed up his time to help more with William. He was a devoted father, patient and playful, and watching him with their son made Eleanor fall in love with him all over again. In 1873, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and while the sickness was still unpleasant, she managed it better. Their daughter was born in May of 1874, an easier birth than William's had been, and they named her Grace Ann. Grace was different from William, calmer and more content. She slept well from the start and rarely fussed. William, now 2.5, was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything. Eleanor's heart felt full to bursting watching her family grow. Dr. Abernathy's health began to decline noticeably in 1875. His hands shook constantly now, and he tired easily. He approached Eleanor one spring afternoon with a proposition. "I want to sell you the practice," he said without preamble. "You have been doing most of the work for the past 2 years anyway, and we both know it. I am tired, Eleanor, and I am ready to spend my remaining years in peace. I will give you a fair price, with payments over time, so you are not burdened with the whole cost at once." Eleanor was both honored and daunted by the offer. She discussed it with Vincent that evening, laying out the financial implications and the increased responsibility it would mean. "I think you should do it," Vincent said without hesitation. "You have earned this, Eleanor. You are a better doctor than most men with actual medical degrees. And as for the money, the ranch is doing well. We can manage the payments." So, Eleanor became the owner of her own medical practice, one of the very few women in the country to hold such a position. She knew there would be people who objected, who thought a woman had no business practicing medicine, but she also knew that her work spoke for itself. The people of Ellsworth and the surrounding area trusted her, relied on her, and that was what mattered. Dr. Abernathy stayed on for a few months to help with the transition, then retired to a small house near his daughter's family in Missouri. He wrote to Eleanor regularly, and she always wrote back, sharing news of the practice in the town and her family. As her children grew, Eleanor made sure they understood the privilege of their position and the importance of helping others. William loved accompanying her on calls, asking endless questions about medicine and injuries and how the body worked. Grace was more interested in the emotional side of healing, in comforting patients and making them feel cared for. Vincent taught them both to ride, to work the ranch, to handle animals with confidence and competence. He told them stories about their mother's bravery during the war, making sure they understood what she had sacrificed and endured. One evening in 1876, when William was nearly 5 and Grace 2, a man came to the ranch looking for Eleanor. He was probably 40, with graying hair and a limp, and when Vincent answered the door, he asked if this was the home of Nurse Harper, who had worked the field hospitals during the war. Vincent felt a cold sense of unease, but called Eleanor to the door. She came with Grace on her hip, and William clutching her skirt, and looked at the man with polite confusion. "I am Eleanor Hale, formerly Harper. May I help you?" The man's face worked with emotion. "You do not remember me, and I would not expect you to. But I remember you, Miss Harper. I am Thomas Miller. and you saved my life in a field hospital near Fredericksburg in 1863. I had taken a Minié ball to the chest, and the doctors said I would not make it. But you refused to accept that. You stayed with me for 3 days, keeping the fever down, getting water into me when I could barely swallow. My wife at the time wrote my mother that I was dead. They had given up on me so completely. But you did not give up. Eleanor stared at him, and slowly a memory surfaced. A young man, barely 20, with a terrible chest wound. She had been certain he would die, but something about the way he fought made her fight too. I remember, she said softly. You pulled through against all odds. The surgeon said it was a miracle. You were the miracle, Thomas said, his voice rough. I went home after the war, found out my wife had remarried thinking I was dead, and started over out here in Kansas. I have a new wife now, 2 children, and a farm 10 miles north of here. I only just learned that you were living in the area, and I had to come. I had to thank you for my life. Everything good I have now exists because you would not let me die. Eleanor felt Vincent's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. She saw Thomas looking at her children, at the life she had built, and she understood in a new way what Vincent had been trying to tell her all those years ago. The ripples spread out, touching lives in ways you could never fully know. I am so glad you found happiness, she said to Thomas, and I am glad I could help when you needed it. That is all I ever wanted to do. Thomas left with tears in his eyes, but Vincent noticed more tears in Eleanor's. After they put the children to bed, he held her while she cried, not from sadness but from a release of old pain. Do you know how many times I have wondered if any of it mattered? She said into his chest. How many times I thought about all the men who died despite everything I did, and wondered if I had made any difference at all. You saved more than you know, Eleanor, Vincent said, echoing the words he had spoken to her all those years ago in Dr. Abernathy's office. Thomas is just one. There are dozens more, maybe hundreds, walking around living their lives because of you. And even the ones who died, you gave them comfort in their last hours. You made sure they were not alone. That matters, my love. That matters so much. The years continued to pass with surprising speed. William grew tall and serious, fascinated by medicine and determined to become a doctor himself. Eleanor encouraged him, though she knew the path would be difficult, that medical schools were only starting to admit a handful of students who were not from wealthy families. But she saved money toward his education, and Vincent supported the dream fully. Grace grew into a compassionate, beautiful girl who had her mother's healing touch and her father's steady strength. She helped in the medical practice from a young age, learning how to roll bandages and mix medicines and comfort frightened patients. In 1878, Eleanor was approached by a group of women from surrounding settlements who wanted to learn basic medical skills. They could not afford to train as nurses formally, but they wanted to know how to handle common injuries and illnesses in their remote homes where doctors were hours or days away. Eleanor agreed enthusiastically and began teaching monthly classes at the church, covering everything from setting broken bones to treating fevers to delivering babies. The classes were popular, and soon Eleanor had taught dozens of women who spread out across Kansas carrying knowledge that saved lives. Vincent was proud beyond words of his wife's impact on the region. Their ranch had grown into a successful operation, providing steady income that allowed Eleanor to sometimes work without pay for those who could not afford it. He was able to give generously to the church and the school, to help neighbors in difficult times, and he did so gladly, knowing that he and Eleanor had been blessed beyond measure. In 1880, William, at 9 years old, found a wounded dog on the prairie, a half-wild thing with a leg broken and infected. He brought it home, begging his mother to help, and Eleanor, seeing her son's compassion, agreed to try. She set the dog's leg and treated the infection, and William nursed the animal back to health with single-minded dedication. The dog, whom William named Scout, became fiercely devoted to the boy. Vincent saw in his son's care for Scout the same kind of determination Eleanor showed with difficult patients, and he knew that William truly had inherited his mother's calling. Grace, at 6, was more interested in the ranch animals, particularly the horses. Vincent taught her to ride almost before she could walk, and she had a natural gift for understanding and gentling even the most spirited horses. She would sit for hours in the barn with a sick or injured animal, her presence somehow calming them. In the summer of 1881, a cholera outbreak hit Ellsworth. Eleanor threw herself into fighting the disease with every bit of knowledge and skill she possessed. She quarantined the sick, enforced strict hygiene protocols, and worked around the clock caring for patients. Vincent and the children barely saw her for 2 weeks as she fought to contain the outbreak. Vincent brought her meals she barely touched, insisted she sleep for at least a few hours each night, and kept the children away so they would not be exposed. It was terrifying, watching Eleanor push herself to the brink of exhaustion, knowing she was exposing herself to deadly disease. But Vincent knew better than to try to stop her. This was who she was, and he loved her for it, even as he feared for her. When the outbreak finally burned itself out, Eleanor had saved more lives than had been lost. An almost unheard of outcome for cholera. The town hailed her as a hero, but Eleanor was simply grateful that more families had not been destroyed. She came home and slept for a full day, and when she woke, Vincent was there with William and Grace, who piled onto the bed and hugged their mother fiercely. "You are the bravest person I know," William said solemnly, and Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "I am just doing what I am meant to do," she said. "Just like your father does what he is meant to do with the ranch, and like both of you will do someday with whatever calls to your hearts." As the decade progressed, Ellsworth grew and changed. The wild cattle town of Eleanor's arrival had settled into a more established community with schools and churches, a library, and a small bank. Vincent served on the town council and Eleanor on the school board, both of them committed to building something lasting. In 1885, William at 14 announced his definite intention to study medicine. Eleanor had been saving for this, and Vincent agreed without hesitation to commit whatever funds were needed. They began researching medical schools, looking for programs that might accept a student of William's youth and financial situation. It was Eleanor's reputation that opened doors. She wrote to colleagues she had corresponded with over the years, and several wrote back recommending William for early admission based on his mother's standing in the medical community. In the fall of 1886, at just 15, William left for medical school in Chicago, young but prepared by years of working alongside his mother. Eleanor cried when the train pulled away, and Vincent held her as they watched it disappear into the distance. "He is going to be brilliant," Vincent said, just like his mother. Grace at 12 was flourishing, helping increasingly with the ranch management and showing a shrewd head for business that impressed Vincent. She talked about breeding horses, about developing a line known for steadiness and strength, and Vincent encouraged the dream. In 1888, Eleanor at 44 found herself unexpectedly pregnant again. She had thought she was past the age for children, that William and Grace would be their only ones. The pregnancy was more difficult than her previous ones, her body older and less resilient, but she managed it with typical determination. Their second daughter was born in early 1889, and they named her Rose Margaret, after the roses that bloomed wild on the prairie, and after Eleanor's cousin, who had been such a support. William came home from medical school for the birth, and Grace was fascinated by her tiny sister. Vincent, at 47, was a doting father all over again, carrying Rose everywhere and marveling at the miracle of having this new life to nurture. "I thought we were done with babies," he said, but he was grinning as he said it, clearly delighted. As the 1880s gave way to the 1890s, Eleanor's medical practice continued to thrive. She took on a young assistant, a woman named Clara who wanted to learn nursing, and began training her much as she had been trained by Dr. Abernathy all those years ago. William completed medical school in 1892 at 21 and decided to return to Kansas to practice alongside his mother. Eleanor was thrilled beyond measure to have her son as a colleague and partner. Together, they expanded the practice, with William handling more of the surgical cases, while Eleanor focused on general medicine and obstetrics. Grace at 18 had grown into a confident young woman who ran the ranch's horse breeding program with impressive skill. She had a suitor, a young rancher named Daniel Cooper from a neighboring spread, and while Vincent put on a show of protective fatherhood, he could see that Daniel was a good man who treated Grace with respect and admiration. Grace and Daniel were married in the summer of 1894, in a ceremony that rivaled the grandeur of Eleanor and Vincent's simple wedding, with its scale and celebration. The whole county seemed to turn out, testament to the regard in which the Hale family was held. Rose at 5 was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, keeping Eleanor on her toes in ways her older children had not. She wanted to know everything, wanted to be involved in everything. and Eleanor saw in her youngest child perhaps the strongest will of all. In 1896, William married a young woman he had met in medical school, another physician named Catherine, and Eleanor gained not just a daughter-in-law, but another medical colleague. Catherine was brilliant and compassionate, and Eleanor loved her immediately. Grace gave them their first grandchild in 1897, a boy they named Vincent after his grandfather. Vincent Hale held his namesake and marveled at the passage of time, at how quickly life moved from one generation to the next. Eleanor at 53 still worked nearly every day, though she had cut back on the most physically demanding aspects of medicine. She supervised more than did hands-on work, training Clara and supporting William and Catherine in their practice. She had become the elder stateswoman of medicine in that part of Kansas, respected and beloved. On a warm evening in June of 1898, Eleanor and Vincent sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the prairie. Rose was playing in the yard, William and Catherine were staying in town near their practice, and Grace was at her own ranch with Daniel and little Vincent. The house was quiet in a way it had not been for decades. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" Eleanor asked, her hand in Vincent's. "From that day you came into the office with an infection to now?" Vincent raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I think about it often. I think about how close I came to dying from sheer stubbornness, refusing to take care of a simple wound. If I had not come in that day, had not met you, my whole life would be different. Everything good in my life stems from that moment." "I was so lost when I came to Ellsworth," Eleanor said, "so damaged by the war, so uncertain if I could ever be whole again. And then you saw me at my worst, frozen with fear, and you brought me back. You have been bringing me back ever since, in 1,000 small ways." "You saved more than you know, Eleanor," Vincent said, using the phrase that had become something of a talisman between them. "You saved soldiers during the war. You saved me from that infection. You saved patients every single day. But you also saved me in a bigger way. You gave me a reason to build instead of drift, to hope instead of just survive. You gave me a family and a home and a purpose. You saved my life in every way that matters." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. "You saved me too. You understood what I had been through. You never asked me to be anything other than who I was. You supported every dream I had and never once suggested I should be less than I could be. You gave me love when I thought I was too broken for it. We saved each other, Vincent." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Rose came running up to show them a firefly she had caught and then released, and they admired it together before she ran off again. "No regrets?" Vincent asked quietly. "Not a single one," Eleanor said. "Everything I suffered through, every hard moment, it all led here. Led to you, to our children and grandchildren, to a life filled with love and purpose. How could I regret any of that?" Vincent pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Here is to the rest of our lives then, however many years we are granted. Here is to growing old together and watching our family grow. Here is to the love we built from the ashes of war." "To the love we built," Eleanor echoed, and kissed him with all the passion and tenderness that 3 decades together had not diminished one bit. In the years that followed, they did indeed grow old together. They welcomed more grandchildren. As Grace and William's families expanded, they watched Rose grow into a determined young woman who decided to follow her mother and brother into medicine, attending one of the first medical schools to actively recruit women students. Vincent's hair turned silver, and his joints ached with arthritis, but he still rode the ranch every day, still made decisions about the operation, even as he gradually handed more responsibility to Grace and Daniel, who had merged their ranch with the original Hale spread. Eleanor's hands developed a slight tremor, the same condition that had plagued Dr. Abernathy, and she gradually transitioned from practicing medicine to primarily teaching and consulting. She wrote articles for medical journals about her experiences, contributing to the growing body of knowledge about nursing and battlefield medicine. She became something of a legend, one of the last surviving Civil War nurses, and was occasionally asked to speak about her experiences. In 1903, they celebrated their 32nd anniversary with a party attended by most of Ellsworth. The town presented them with a plaque honoring their contributions to the community, and Eleanor found herself standing in front of friends and neighbors, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had been given. That night, lying in bed with Vincent's arms around her, Eleanor thought about the girl she had been, broken and lost, and certain she would never feel joy again. She thought about the man who had seen past her walls to the strength beneath, who had loved her not despite her scars, but including them. She thought about the family they had built and the lives they had touched, about the ripples spreading outward in ways they would never fully know. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Vincent whispered back. "My brave, beautiful Eleanor. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They fell asleep together, as they had for over 3 decades, two people who had survived war and built love from the ruins, who had chosen each other every single day and never regretted it. Outside, the Kansas wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of grass and cattle and growing things. Inside, Eleanor and Vincent slept peacefully, safe in each other's arms, their hearts beating in rhythm. Their love, a living thing that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward in their children and grandchildren, in the patients Eleanor had saved, in the community they had served so faithfully. Their story was one of healing and hope, of two damaged souls finding each other and becoming whole. It was a love story born from terrible days, but grown in sunlight and care into something beautiful and lasting. Eleanor had nursed soldiers through war's darkest hours, and Vincent had seen in her the heroism and strength that she had not recognized in herself. Together, they had built a life worth living, had created a family and a legacy that would echo through generations. And when they were very old, when Vincent's health finally began to fail in the winter of 1908, Eleanor sat beside his bed, holding his hand just as she had held the hands of so many dying soldiers all those years ago. But this time, it was different. This time, she was losing the man who had been her partner, her love, her reason for believing in happiness again. "Don not cry," Vincent said, his voice weak but still tender. "We have had a beautiful life, Eleanor, more than I ever dreamed possible. I am not afraid." "I am," Eleanor admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I do not know how to exist in a world without you in it." Vincent reached up with trembling fingers to wipe her tears. "You will do what you have always done. You will keep going, keep helping people, keep loving our family. I will always be with you, Eleanor, in every memory, every shared moment. Our love does not end just because I do." "Promise me something," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "Promise me that you will wait for me, that when my time comes, you will be there." "I promise," Vincent said. "I will be waiting, my love, and we will have eternity together." He died peacefully 2 days later, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, with Eleanor holding his hand to the very end. She felt the moment his spirit left, felt the absence of the man who had been her anchor for 40 years. The grief was crushing, but Eleanor had learned long ago how to function through pain. She mourned deeply, but she did not break. She had Vincent's strength inside her, carried forward through 4 decades of love and partnership. She leaned on her children and grandchildren, let them support her as she had supported so many others. And she kept working because that was what she knew how to do. She kept teaching and consulting, kept checking on patients and offering advice. She watched Rose graduate from medical school in 1909 and felt Vincent's presence beside her. Knew he would have been so proud. Eleanor lived another 7 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1915 at the age of 71. Her children found her in the morning, looking peaceful with a slight smile on her face, and they knew that she had gone to join Vincent at last. The funeral was enormous, with people coming from all over Kansas to pay their respects to the woman who had healed so many, who had taught so much, who had touched so many lives with her compassion and skill. There were elderly men who told stories of how she had saved them during the war, women who credited her with saving their children, families who existed because Eleanor had delivered their grandparents or great-grandparents into the world. William gave the eulogy, his voice steady despite his grief. "My mother used to say that she was just doing what she was meant to do, that her work was simply fulfilling her purpose. But she was more than a skilled nurse or dedicated physician. She was a force of nature, a woman who refused to let death have the final word when she had anything to say about it. She fought for every patient, loved every person who came through her door, and never once turned away someone in need. My father told her once, in the early days of their love, that she had saved more than she knew. I think about that often now. How many lives did she save? How many children are alive because she delivered them safely? How many men and women survived illnesses or injuries because of her skill? The number is impossible to calculate, the ripples impossible to measure. But beyond the lives saved, think about the love she gave to her patients, to her family, to this community. She loved my father with a devotion that inspired everyone who knew them. She loved us, her children, with a fierceness that made us strong. She loved her work with a passion that never dimmed even in her final years. She is not gone, not really. She lives on in every person she taught, in every life she saved, in her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She lives on in the hospital that will bear her name, in the medical practices she inspired, in the changed world she leaves behind. And she lives on in our hearts, where her love and strength will sustain us for the rest of our days. They buried her beside Vincent on a hill overlooking their ranch, and the entire community came to say goodbye. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, William thought he heard his mother's voice on the wind, and with it, his father's. Together at last, their love story complete. The Hale family continued to thrive for generations, carrying forward the legacy of compassion and service that Eleanor and Vincent had built. William's children became doctors, Grace's children became ranchers and horse breeders. Rose's children carried on her medical work. The family spread across Kansas and beyond, but they never forgot the story of their matriarch and patriarch, the nurse and the cowboy, who had found each other in a dusty cattle town and built a love that changed the world around them. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right across the prairie, those who knew where to listen could almost hear them still, two voices twined together, speaking of love and healing, of terrible days survived and beautiful days built, of a salvation that went both ways and lasted forever. Eleanor Harper Hale had nursed soldiers through the worst days imaginable, had carried that trauma with her into a new life in the West. Vincent Hale had recognized in her something precious, had understood what she had sacrificed and endured. He had told her that she had saved more than she knew, and in loving him, in building a life with him, she had finally come to believe it. Together, they had saved each other and created something beautiful from the ashes of war. Their love was their legacy, their family their testament, and their story would be told for generations to come, a reminder that even from the darkest days, hope and love could bloom.